This is a serious topic, I think, because, we had the pig-headedness of the Home Office stopping a mother from bringing in cannabis oil from Canada just a couple of weeks ago to treat her child with epilepsy, because it's still illegal to possess, supply or use cannabis oil for any purpose in this country, even though it's available in lots of other countries, and even though it's recognised as a treatment for pain, anxiety, inflammation, epilepsy, and it was certainly working for this small child who was having it treated perfectly, his epileptic condition in Canada, comes back, is prevented from taking the medication until eventually the Home Office does relent and decide that, well, it's okay after all. Now, why has it not been legalised? I've got a theory on this, but let's ask Peter Reynolds, president of CLEAR, which is calling for cannabis law reform. We've got him on the line. Peter, could it be because this is sort of it's a natural remedy? The big pharmaceutical companies aren't going to make a lot of money out of this. Do you think that's part of the problem?
Well, in a word, no. If we had some sort of reform or relaxation of the ridiculous restrictions on cannabis, it would greatly benefit the pharmaceutical companies who are working on it. I'm not a subscriber to this mythology about pharmaceutical companies being responsible for holding back access to cannabis.
So why is it being held back then? What's stopping it happening?
Well, it is lazy, ignorant, prejudiced, and stupid politicians. If you really wanted summed up succinctly, that is the reason. I mean, historically, the reason has been because they're scared stiff of being portrayed as soft on drugs by the tabloids. But in fact, the tabloids have moved on. The tabloids have stopped publishing their ridiculous stories about cannabis-crazed axe murderers, and they've now gone on to a different form of sensationalism, which, after all, is all they're interested in. Yeah. And they're now publishing stories about, even miraculous medical success stories. So politicians are just completely out of touch.
But I'm sure you're right. That is a big part of the problem. In fact, it may be the entire issue. But there's a process, isn't there, for getting drugs cleared and approved. I'm just wondering whether, and a lot of that does relate to manufactured solutions, whereas here is something this is something natural. I'm just wondering if is there not a process perhaps which is slowing it down?
Yes, no, you're right. You're quite right about that. And this is one of the government's latest excuse. Year by year, as the overwhelming evidence for the medical efficacy of cannabis gets stronger and stronger, year by year, our government keeps on coming out with a slightly different excuse. And its latest excuse has been that, something, I'm paraphrasing it, but it's something to the effect of all drugs have to go through rigorous testing procedures to ensure their safety and efficacy, which sounds very plausible on the face of it. But cannabis is rather different because the rigorous testing procedures that we have for drugs and medicines run by the MHRA is all based around single molecule medicines that have been synthesized in a lab. Cannabis is a 500 molecule plus medicine that's produced by a plant. And quite clearly, you can't regulate the two things in the same way. It's absurd to suggest so. And also, what's more, we have 10,000 years of evidence, at least 10,000 years of evidence that shows cannabis is being used safely and effectively as medicine. But the thing that really knocks this excuse on the head is that if you look in every single jurisdiction throughout the world, and that is now most of the civilized world, where cannabis has been made legally available, there's a separate system outside of pharmaceuticals regulation has been set up, and that's what we need to do in the UK.
Yeah, because it's been shown to work overseas. I mean, how much do we need to test? If there's countries that we would consider, our peers, places like Canada, for example, many parts of Europe as well, where it's legal, why wouldn't we just accept the fact that it works? I'm sure there are side effects, but I'm sure Billy Caldwell's mum wasn't too concerned about any side effects because the benefits were just so much more significant than not taking it at all. I mean, we had, this poor kid just basically went into remission.
Exactly. I mean, you're absolutely correct. But you said at the beginning about the Home Office, and I mean, this phrase that came out during the Windrush scandal, hostile environment, really defines everything about the Home Office. That's the way it behaves to the British people, the people who it's supposed to be protecting. It doesn't protect us at all. It pursues a set of policies that aren't based on evidence, and for 50 years it's been systematically misleading and misinforming the British public about cannabis. And we've seen in these extraordinary couple of weeks, we've seen more progress than we've seen in the last 50 years, because the courageous actions of Charlotte and Billy have exposed all the nonsense that's been going on. And from my point of view, one other thing I want to say is it is sickening to see so many MPs now jumping on the bandwagon and pretending they've been behind this all the time. Some MPs, I won't name them, who only a year or two ago I was talking to directly and were telling me there's no evidence at all. And now suddenly they're all coming around. But that's British politics for you.
Yeah, that is British politics. It's world politics, I think, really. I don't think we're unique in that. But what about the difference between, I mean, having cannabis available to treat issues like epilepsy, for example, having it as a medical cure is different to recreational purposes. Where do we draw the line on that?
Well, I mean, our position has always been, our campaign slogan has always been, join the campaign for medicinal cannabis on prescription and regulated access for adults. So we recognise very clearly that, the urgent need is to enable people who need it as medicine to gain access to it. That takes priority over everything else.
And it's hard to dispute that.
But beyond...
It's hard to dispute that.
Well, I don't... I've spent, since I first gave evidence to Parliament on this subject in 1983. And I've been fighting this battle ever since, and I agree with you, it's hard to dispute it. But nevertheless, our politicians have managed to dispute it ever since then. And now they're all having some sort of moment on the road to Damascus. But as far as recreational use is concerned, I mean, the only purpose of any drugs policy must be to reduce harm. And the fact is that the policies we've pursued against the recreational use of cannabis haven't reduced harm at all. What they've done is they've maximised harm. Because they've taken what is a £6 billion market. Clearly there's massive public demand for it, and they've just gifted this market to criminals. The criminals who don't care who they sell to. So cannabis is sold on the street to children. Criminals who don't care about the quality of the product, so the product's harvested far too early, before it's developed all its cannabinoids and before it's developed the proper natural balance, so you have a more harmful form of cannabis available. People who use violence to enforce their turf, people who use human trafficking to get their labour. And yet, the only people, really, our government and the criminal gangs are on the same side in this argument, and it's the rest of us, the public, who are on the other side. Yeah. If you support prohibition, then you're supporting organised crime.
So the idea that if we regulate it, then we've got those sorts of controls. And I guess we're going to have to move on, unfortunately. I wish we had more time to talk, Peter. But I mean, we hear the downside being if you take too much of it, then you can get psychotic symptoms, you can get schizophrenia. But I guess if we regulate it, and we and we use some money for education as well, we can study that sort of stuff. And we can also educate people, so don't go too overboard, like we have done with alcohol. And it is fair enough, isn't it? I think, to compare the two.
Oh, I think it is, absolutely. But the harms of cannabis have been vastly over-exaggerated. And I mean, that's very easily proven by simply looking at the facts of healthcare records. If you look at how many people are actually having to have healthcare treatment related to cannabis, it's tiny. Yeah. Even in proportionate terms, it's tiny compared to alcohol.
Peter, appreciate your work. Carry on with your work, and great to talk to you today. That's Peter Reynolds, the president of CLEAR, which is campaigning to legalise cannabis in the UK for medicinal purposes, also for recreational purposes. On the medicinal front, I think the Home Office has sort of confessed now, haven't they, that they've made a mistake. They've relented in the case of Billy Caldwell. The fact that they've said, well, OK, we need to make it available for Billy. It solves his problem. It's helped cure his condition. He'll never be fully cured, but at least it's got him, at least he's not suffering quite so much. That's an admission, surely, that that cannabis does have some positive traits that helps people. And if that's the case, if they're making it available for Billy Caldwell, what about anybody else who suffers a similar condition? It's Love Sport. Stay with us.